Welcome back, everybody, to Gear Gods Presents Studio Pass with Kurt Ballou here on Creative Live. We are going into our final segment of this, our first day of this two-day workshop. This morning we talked about dealing with clients and kind of some of those intangibles that really do contribute to the sound that you are going to get from them. And then the past two segments have been about setting up and then tracking and editing drums. So now it's about time to move on to another instrument. We're going to talk guitar for the rest of the day. So Kurt, take it away.
Yes, guitar, my favorite instrument and the best instrument, and the reason why drums exist is to support the guitar. By the way, how many guitarists do we have here? Oh, you're outnumbered. So yeah, we're going to talk a lot about guitar, and let's just kick it off with a little video of me recording Nice Hooves guitars in my studio.
The bottom feels a little squashed to me, actually, which is why I'm grabbing this pedal. It's stinky. My strategy, I guess, right now is this pedal, this amp, that cab for you.
Yep.
The same guitar for both of you.
Cool.
And then the other pedal, the other head, but the same cab.
Yeah.
Should work.
Yeah. Cool.
And if it doesn't, we'll try something else. Got a fancy prototype mic to try on this guitar.
Oh yeah.
This shiny guy.
Nice.
It's an AAN22 active ribbon mic. Many buzzwords.
Do you do anything to check angles of the mics?
Just visual. That's a Predator.
Yeah, yeah. The three red dots show up on your forehead. Here I am! Come and get it to me! first note seemed weird to me.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy with
It's supposed to be kind of like I'm bending it in different places just to make it. It doesn't sound like perfect every time. I kind of want it to sound a little gross.
Well, you've achieved your goal.
Gross times.
That's hanging out in my studio, and it's what I do. It's fun to get to hang out with your friends all the time and make cool tunes, and that's what NISOs are. And I'm really thankful that those guys were able to make it out and make some cool tunes with me. So I'm just going to get right into the basics of guitar sounds, and so the first thing would be setting up your guitar. When a band comes into my studio, what I like to do first, especially if I'm not already familiar with them and we don't already have a recording plan, is to take a listen to what they sound like already before I try to change what they're doing. Try to like give them my stuff to play on. I want to hear and feel what their sound already is, and if they're playing on gear that they love, or if they're playing on certain gear just because that's what they happen to have. And the first thing that I'll do is check out their instruments. Much like a lot of drummers aren't so hot at tuning their drums, a lot of guitarists aren't so hot at setting up their guitars. And so I kind of want to quickly go through guitar setup to give you guys some background on what to do to kind of optimize the guitar that you have. And if you have trouble playing your guitar, or if it's not set up well, then it's not going to record well. It's not going to come out in tune, and it's going to be more difficult to play, and it's going to be challenging all around to record. So if your guitar is dialed in, everything else is going to be that much easier. So I want to just do some examples with my guitar over here. I've actually never even checked any of the stuff on this since I got it. So let's go through that together. All right, so hopefully it won't attack me. And let's, can we pull up Pro Tools on the big screen? And I've got Amplitude 3 running there, and is a tuner? Yeah, there's a tuner over there. So, yeah. So first thing, before we start setting up the guitar, you want to make sure that you have a good instrument, an appropriate instrument for the style of music you're going to be working on. If you're doing like some metal, you probably don't want something with single coil pickups. If you're doing, some funk, you might not want humbuckers. So try to get like a good instrument for what you're doing. If you're doing like low tuned stuff, you're probably going to be better off with heavier gauge strings and a longer scale length, because that'll give you more tension on your strings. And if you're playing a lot of rhythm stuff and not really doing any lead guitar or any bending, then it's totally fine if you have a wound G string on your guitar. But if you're doing a lot of lead guitar and bending and stuff, you might want to go with a wound G string. So my sort of bass tuning, I do a lot of different tunings in my band Converge, but my basic tuning is D standard, and I think that's approximately what this guitar is in right now. And this one is a 25.5 inch long scale length, which is the typical Fender, Stratocaster, Jazzmaster, and Telecaster scale length. The typical Gibson scale length is more like 24 3/4 or 24 5/8 or something like that. So this is, with like a Gibson, a lot of like lead guitarists like that because of the shorter scale length. It can be a little bit easier to bend strings, whereas like I'm mostly a rhythm player, so I like having a little extra tension. I feel like I get more tone and more consistent pitch in the extra tension that I get from a longer scale length and heavier gauge strings. This particular guitar right now has, I think, some clear tone strings on it that are gauge 54 on the low string, on the low D, all the way through 12 on the high D. Okay, so once you've got your...
Kurt, real quick, they're saying they're not getting the audio from the guitar and the board.
I'm not playing the guitar. What about that? If they were getting Pro Tools, earlier, they should be getting it because it should be coming out the main outputs. They're getting it now?
We're checking.
just riff a little bit for you guys. Any requests?
We're going to have somebody come in and
Okay,
check it
well
out.
the audio, honestly the audio, I need to be able to see the tuner for this guitar, but the sound coming off it doesn't really matter, so I kind of don't care, so I'll just keep going.
For the folks at home.
Yeah, but I mean like, yeah, it'll help, but it's not crucial what I'm doing as long as you can see the tuner. I will actually, before I get into this stuff, there's one thing kind of interesting about guitar setup that's probably maybe a little beyond the average guitar player's ability, which is the height of the nut. If you're playing primarily rhythm stuff sort of down in first position, especially like if you're playing an acoustic guitar, typically you want to have a nut set pretty low so that the string height at the nut is, just barely above the first fret. So going from like open to first fret should feel about the same distance as going from a first fret fretted note to a second fret fretted note. When you do that, you sort of have to set it up so that the bridge is set kind of high and the strings have a high action further up on the neck, which is why it can be kind of difficult to solo on the typical acoustic guitar. If you're a lead guitar player and playing a lot in the high register, you might actually want your nut set a little bit higher. And then, so when you have the nut set high down low, you can set the action of the strings at the top of the guitar a little bit lower. So let's just, for argument's sake, assume that your friendly guitar tech has set up your nut in the right way and you're happy with that. And then, as you're getting ready to record and you want to make sure that your guitar is dialed in for the songs you're going to be playing, the tuning you're using, the string gauge, the atmospheric conditions and whatnot, because everything affects the action and the intonation. So wood used to be alive, wood moves, you can't rely on wood to always be in the same place. So as you change elevation and humidity, sometimes the neck moves around. And when that happens, you might need to make adjustments to the rest of the guitar for that. And as you change string gauges and tunings, the neck moves as well, so there's compensations you need to make for that stuff. So, Step one is to check out your neck and see if you need to adjust your truss rod. And the way that I like to do that is to press down at the first fret on any of the strings, and then press down with your other hand around, say, the 15th fret, and then look about halfway in between there to see if there's any gap between the strings and the fretboard. And there is a slight gap between the strings and the fretboards here. There's a slight gap between the strings and the top fret here, which means that there's some relief in the neck. And you always want to have a little bit of relief in the neck. Typically, if you had 3 arms and you could press down here and here, you could take a hand and then slide a pick in between one of the frets and the strings, and you should see about a pick's width of gap between the top of the fret and the bottom of a string. The neck on this guitar right now is a little bit too straight. It doesn't have a whole lot of relief. I'm not going to take the time to do it right now, but what I would do if I were to adjust the truss rod would be to take the truss rod cover off. On this style neck where it has a tilt back headstock, the truss rod's up here, but a lot of other guitars, you'll find, like on a Fender, you might actually have to take the neck off to do it because the truss rod adjustment is at the back of the neck. And occasionally you'll see it at the side of the neck. This one's up here. So what I would do to impart more relief in the neck, which is to bend the fretboard more in this direction, is I would take the truss rod cover off and do about a quarter turn counterclockwise, so to loosen the truss rod, and which will allow the strings to pull the neck up, giving you a little bit more relief in the neck. And you want to do those adjustments slowly, and you want to allow it a chance to settle in. So if you adjust it, you might not want to do more than a half to 3/4 of a turn per day. If it's a desperate situation, if you flew into a show somewhere that's totally different elevation or climate, you might have to do it more quickly than that. But I try to do those adjustments slowly. So once you have your truss rod set so that there's only a small gap, giving you just a little bit of relief in the neck, the next thing to do is to just by feel, dial in the action. On a bridge like this happens to be a shallower roller bridge, so the radius of the strings is in a fixed position on all of the tunematic style bridges, and like the Gretsch type bridges, and I think like Mustang and Jaguar type bridges, unless you have an aftermarket one, do sort of some of those. I mean, not Mustang, Jazzmaster one's kind of fixed. Actually, I can't remember now. Anyway, I don't have individual control of the action of each of these strings, but I have master control of the bass and treble side. So I'll kind of like, by adjusting these thumb wheels, and sometimes they're really tight, sometimes you have to loosen the strings in order to do it, or grab them with some kind of pliers or something, adjust the action so that it's comfortable. I personally don't care if my guitar buzzes a little bit. I like pretty low action, not just because I'm lazy, but because the less I have to deflect a string, or really I'm trying to make it easy for myself. So the less I deflect a string, the easier it is. But also, minimal deflection will create fewer intonation problems. So it's just, you know, when I started playing saxophone as a kid, my instructor always told me, like, you know, smaller movements are faster. So, you know, if you have a guitar with kind of low action, you can do smaller movements, and you can play faster and more fluidly, and you're less likely to kind of bump into the adjacent strings when you don't want to. A reason for higher action is if you're playing really clean and you don't want to hear any buzzing, you might want to have higher action, or if you have a particularly highly radiused fretboard, like a lot of old Fenders do, particularly like Mustangs and Jaguars have extremely radiused fretboards. So with those guitars, like if you try to bend something on the B string, you're bending into the radius of the fretboard, and it'll bottom out unless you have kind of high action. This neck has a compound radius on the fretboard, so it's pretty flat when you get to the top. So bending is easy up there, and I don't really have to worry about that on this guitar, so I can have pretty low action. If you have individually adjustable saddles, like a lot of Fender guitars tend to have, or things with a lot of hardtail bridge guitars have individually adjustable saddles. I think like Kahlers and Floyds might also. Then you want to try to be aware of the radius of your fretboard. There are radius gauges that you can buy, but you can also kind of do it visually and try to set it so that the radius of the top of the string sort of follows a similar radius to the top of your fretboard. Okay, so now you're at the point where you have selected a great string gauge that's appropriate for your tuning. You have your nut dialed in where you want it. There's a little bit of relief in your fretboard. You have the action, so it's feeling great. And at this point too, you may also want to adjust your pickup height to make sure that it's close, but the strings don't bottom out. Like if you do some kind of muting technique, like that's kind of bottoming out, you want to make sure the pickups are out of the way. And then the final thing to do, which is the thing that seems to confuse most guitarists, is the intonation. So the principle of intonation is that you want to make sure that each string will play in tune over the entire length of the fretboard. So here's my high D string, and I'm looking at my tuner if you want to switch to Pro Tools for a second. So I'm going to tune it up, and actually I can't really see it well from where I am, but it doesn't go green in the middle? All right, well, it's pretty much in tune. So what I want to do is sort of make sure that over the entire neck that it will still play in tune. So the easiest thing for me to do is to, instead of just hitting, actually one little trick, sometimes turning down the tone knob, which removes the attack a little bit from influencing the tuner, will give you a more accurate readout. I'm going to play the 12th fret harmonic on my high D string. The 12th fret harmonic has nothing to do with where the frets are positioned. That will always be dead center in the string. You're sort of creating a node with your finger that puts a dead spot in the center of the string, so the two sides on either side of your finger are vibrating independently of each other. Always dead center. So you know that that's exactly one octave up from open, okay? Now I want to compare the 12th fret harmonic to the 12th fret fretted note. So it's a little bit flat, but watch this. If I fret hard, see how sharp it is? If I pick hard, See how sharp it goes? Now I'm gonna fret very lightly and pick it softly. It's kind of flat. And this is where, and also I'm holding the guitar in my lap and I'm putting some tension on the neck as I fret. I have my forearm on the edge of the body. I'm pulling back on the neck as I fret. So where I think a lot of guitar techs fail is that they do this on a table with the guitar like this, the headstock's in a cradle, and there's just the weight of the guitar is pushing down in the center. Whereas when you're playing a guitar, particularly when you're sitting down, you're in the opposite position where you're pulling tension on the neck. So sometimes people will get their guitar set up before they come into my studio, and then they come into the studio and the intonation's not good and we have to redo it. So it's good, I think it's great if you can do your own intonation because only you know how hard you're going to pick and how hard you're going to fret. So if you see that your 12th fret is a bit hard for me to see there. This will not be an exact science, but if you see that your 12th fret harmonic is reasonably in tune, and then that it's a little bit flat from the way that you position it, you know that the distance between the 12th fret and the saddle on that string, since it's coming out flat, that distance is a little bit too long. We want to shorten that distance to raise the pitch of the string between the 12th fret and the saddle. So I kind of hate adjusting two pneumatic bridges because they're hard to get to, but I have this flathead screwdriver, and I'm going to turn so that I can hopefully not break the string and shorten the distance between the saddle and the 12th fret. It's going to throw off the tuning of the entire string, so you want to retune the string first. So it looks better now. Not perfect, but for the sake of this discussion, I think that's good enough. And you would then do that across the course of the entire guitar. You can also do other tests at other points on the fretboard to see how it looks. If you find that you're playing primarily in, first or second position, you really want to dial it in there. And if you find yourself playing a lot of higher stuff, you want to dial it in there. The final thing that I'll say about guitar tuning before moving on to the guitar amp stuff is that it's important to have an understanding about how the gears within your tuners work. And a lot of cheap acoustic guitars actually offer a better example of that than the typical electrical guitar tuner. So you'll see, if you see a cheap acoustic, you can actually see the open gears of the tuner. So imagine my fingers are the teeth of the gears, okay? As you tune up, there's a little bit of play, and you can always feel this in the tuners as you do it. There's some play between the teeth. So as you're tuning up the guitar, it does this and pushes up. And then the string tension sort of pulls in this direction too. What you don't want to do is tune down the guitar, because when you tune down the guitar, the gears are pushing in that direction, but the string tension then has this room to play. So as you start playing your guitar, you have this much slack in the tuner that the string tension will pull out of the tuning peg. So what you always want to do is tune below the pitch and then back up to it, and that will engage the tuning peg most effectively, and you'll stay in tune longer, and you'll just generally tune better. So, and just actually one other quick statement about tuning is with regards to really low tuning. So let's take this down to C. Okay, so I'm in C. Let me just hit C real lightly, kind of dial it in. The other thing you can do if you don't feel like tuning below and then back up is just give it a stretch between every tune. All right. So hitting it lightly, a little sharp, but you hit it hard, it goes way sharp. So if you're doing low tunings and you're playing really hard, you might actually want to intentionally tune your bottom string flat, There's been some records that I've done where I've tuned the bass as much as 30 cents flat intentionally to get the bass to sound in tune with the guitars. So be really careful with low tunings. You'll see less of that phenomenon with longer scale length guitars. And that's, not that I would ever play a fan fret guitar, but that's the reason why people do that stuff, is to be able to handle those really extreme low tunings. All right, so that's it for this guitar setup stuff.
Really quick, just to let you know, John Doe says, wow, I finally understand intonation. Such a good explanation. So you are pulling the wool off of people's eyes. So
Yeah,
congratulations.
really what I'm doing is hoping that future bands that I record are watching this segment so I don't have to set up their guitars for them.
So, by the way, like for anybody who's watched a few of our classes, note that, you know, everybody, Kurt, Andrew Wade, Jesse Cannon, A.L. Levy, like it might seem like tuning your guitar is basic stuff, and it is, but there's a reason why all of them like beat you over the head with it. Like people show up with their guitars out of tune all the time, don't know how to tune them, not set up properly, not intonated. And if your guitar is not intonated properly, and if your guitar is not in tune, you will never be able to get the tone you want out of it, period. So that's why this stuff is so critical, and it's not super fun and sexy, but it's the first step, and if you don't get this step right, the other stuff doesn't matter.
I agree. And I'll just say one more comment about that is I find that I play much differently when I'm recording than I do when I'm playing live. You know, like when I'm playing live, it's, you know, fun to rock out and get into it, but when I'm recording, I'm actually playing not softly, but much more controlled, because I want that sort of, I feel like chords have more impact when they hit in tune, especially once you start layering. If you choose to layer your guitars in bass, if you have like several layers that are all struck really hardly and they're all kind of wobbly, then you know, it's just going to sound like a mess. But if you strike them with control, then it just will have that much more impact.
And maybe one final question from Maple Bacon. Sounds actually really good right now. What if you do a lot of lead and rhythm playing? Where should the nut be set? Somewhere in between?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you'll know when you play. You know, if you've been playing for a while, you'll know that it feels good or it doesn't. Or also, you know, it's always worthwhile to go into like if you've had the same guitar for a long time and you're really married to it. It's worthwhile to go into guitar shops sometime and just play stuff that's on the wall and say like, oh yeah, this one feels like this and that one feels like this, and hey, maybe this thing is, you know, like I went to a guitar shop one time and played this Rickenbacker 650, and it was the first time that I ever played a guitar that had a 1 3/4 inch wide fretboard. Typically guitars have 1 11/16 wide fretboards. And I was like, whoa, I have these like giant hands, and for the first time I have this little extra space on the fretboard. It's only a 32nd of an inch, but it made, or a 16th of an inch, and it made a huge difference in my ability to play. And so sometimes, like, you know, same thing with the nut. You might go into a guitar shop and realize like, oh, you know what? Like jumbo frets work better for me, or like a taller nut or a lower nut or shorter frets or whatever work better for me. Like this guitar that I built, like I personally don't like really tall frets. Some people love them because they can get underneath the frets and bend more easily. For me, tall frets just give me more space to fret too hard. And so with tall frets, especially like when they're so tall they almost have a scalloped feel, you know, you got a lot of space before your finger bottoms out on the fretboard, and you can really go quite sharp just by fretting hard. So for me, I use pretty flat, low frets, so there's not a lot of space for me to press too far into the neck, and it helps me play in tune better. So educate yourself.
Questions in here? Oh yeah, one.
Yeah, I just want to say intonation and playing position is huge.
Yeah,
and
for
then also another thing with passive pickups, the magnets in them pull on the strings, so it helps to back them way off while you're doing that.
Yeah, these ones are actually probably a little high right now. Yeah, it is a fine balance between output and magnetism, and if you want and sustain. So yeah, if you want a lot of sustain, you do want to lower your pickups. That is an argument for for active pickups. You know, I know a lot of people aren't fans of active pickups, but they do have less magnetism, so you can position them closer to the strings and not have as many sustain issues. And I know of other people, particularly bass players, who've complained about certain really high output pickups, high output passive pickups, really putting too much drag on their strings and interfering with the sustain. So yeah, that is another crucial thing. Thanks for bringing that up.
Great. And maybe one more from Dano. What about guitar cables? What makes a good cable from a bad one?
Yeah. Well, that's certainly a long and hotly contested thing. Certainly, if you've ever a good thing you can do is take your regular guitar cable, plug into your amp, see how it sounds, then get like the smallest guitar cable you have and stand right up against your amp, plug that in and see how that sounds. You will absolutely hear more sparkle coming out of the shorter cable. There's a phenomenon called cabled capacitance, which you'll hear as a sort of a narrowing of the frequency response that happens with long cables. There are certain types of cables that are better than others. Good oxygen-free copper or cable or silver-plated copper is great. People hear a difference between stranded wire and solid core wire. Typically, guitar cables are stranded wire just for the flexibility of it. And there's also cables that have like little wall warts built into them that are active cables that will remove cable capacitance. I know some people who say they prefer the sound of a wireless because the cable runs are shorter. So that's something for you to determine for yourself, but good quality cables, like Mogami's and Redco's are great. What I have here is a new line of American-made Planet Waves cable, which has a specially designed jack that's sort of meant to be universal and work with a lot of different female jacks. So I can kind of plug this into any guitar and not worry about it working well. And I think these cables sound great. They're super durable. And mostly what I'm thinking about with the cable is durability and field serviceability. I try to steer away from cables with molded strain reliefs on the end because those cables you can't open up if something goes wrong. You can cut the end or sort of guess where the short might be, cut the end off, and then install your own connector later, which I do sometimes. But it's nice to have, something like this. If somebody, not uncommon in a Converge show for somebody to like yank on a cable or stand on a cable, or one guy's running one way, one guy's running the other way. Someone stands on a cable and the cable gets ripped in half or something. You can just cut it down and solder the connector back on the the stray half. So it's mostly, I think for me, cables are mostly about serviceability and reliability than they are about ultimate sound quality. But I do try to always keep my cable runs as short as possible. And then when I'm tracking guitars, I try to keep as few effects in the signal chain as possible, just so it's a pure sound getting to the amp. And when I need pedals, we'll plug in just the pedal we need at any given time. And then I also, when possible, I try to run pedals off batteries too, because there's less opportunity for grounding problems when you're running off batteries.
So next time someone yanks out your cable show, just tell them to get back in their seat, keep sipping their glass of wine, and wait for the show to be over.
Yeah.
Then proceed in an orderly fashion to the exit.
I usually just get even.
That's the other option.
No, I don't do that anymore.
Cool. I think we're going to move on.
Okay, cool. So get rid of this piece of junk, and there we go. All right, so what's next? Guitar amps, the good stuff. I am fortunate to have quite a few amps in my studio. Can we go back to, yeah, there we go. We're past guitar setup, and I think I'm missing a slide. I want to talk about choosing a guitar rig. So now we have our guitar dialed in, and like I mentioned earlier, the first thing I like to do is really just see what the band's working with before I try to stick my nose in the middle of their business. I want to, hopefully I've listened to, either I'm familiar with the band because I've recorded them before, which fortunately happens a lot for me, or I've listened to their previous recordings, and I've checked out videos of theirs on YouTube or whatever, and I have a good idea where they're coming from, but I still want to physically hear, if possible, what that stuff is in my studio. So I'll have them set up their rig and and check it out, see what I think, and then I'll talk to them about what it is they like about it, and if there's anything they don't like about it or think that they can improve upon, and then we start the long process of auditioning other gear, and I'll pull out. Sometimes I'll pull out other guitars. Sometimes I'll pull out other guitars, and I'll pull out, sometimes I'll pull out other guitars, and 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 I'll pull out other I have a bunch of guitars around in my studio that that I use sometimes, and a bunch of amps and cabinets as well. And sometimes I'll just actually, more often than not, I make a big line of guitar amps and sort of quickly run down a bunch of different guitar amps and try to see, like, are any of these things resonating with you as a guitarist more than the rig that you're currently playing? Or maybe I can find something that sort of captures the vibe that they have, but does it in a little better way or a more refined way than what their current rig is doing. You know, once I find that, then, you know, maybe there's like there's usually a lot of discussion about, you know, dialing in, you know, what amp we're going to use, and then what cabinet we're going to use and what speakers we're going to use. Do we want to have something that has a ton of headroom and a lot of you know, I've got some Emperor 6x12s in my studio, which are pretty cool and impressive looking, but having, you know, 6 12-inch speakers means there's a ton of they have a ton of power handling, and so they're very very responsive, which can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. If I want to have like a real like chuggy kind of guitar sound that really has a tight bottom end that is super responsive to the guitar playing, then those can be great if I want that headroom. But a lot of times I want a more sort of compressed, focused, mid-rangey guitar signal. And I try to think about how the guitar fits around the other instruments being played. You know, like, is the bass kind of a guitar-y bass, or is the bass more of a bassy bass? And if that's the case, then even though a ton of bottom end on the guitar sounds awesome in the room and it's fun to play this guitar with a ton of bottom, does that bottom end work well in the context of a mix? And you know, am I going to end up sucking all the bottom end out of it when I mix it anyway, or should I just try to get it right at the tracking stage? And same thing with the top. You know, a lot of like modern guitar amps tend to have an excessive amount of sizzle that sort of conflicts with the cymbals. So I really feel like more often than not, guitar lives in the mid-range. So sometimes 1x12s or 2x12s actually, while they might not feel as flattering in the room as a, you know, big giant cabinet that pushes a lot of air, in the context of a mix, it can be actually a lot more focused and require a lot less work after the fact. There's also the benefit in recording with smaller cabinets that you know, each speaker within a larger cabinet has a phase relationship to the adjacent speaker. So like if you're recording, you know, if you have a mic on this speaker and there's a mic beside it, electrically these speakers should be moving together. You know, if you got a mic right here, then, you know, sound from my right hand speaker is getting to that mic in 1 inch, and sound from the left speaker is getting to that mic in 10 inches or 12 inches or whatever it is. So it will, you know, granted that sound is quieter than this sound, but there is actually like a phase discrepancy. And when you do that with a 4x12 or a 6x12, you have that phase discrepancy coming from all over the place. That's why sometimes you'll see people, especially with bigger cabs, miking them from a distance. So rather than like picking up the sound of one individual speaker, they're really picking up the sound of the full cabinet. And that, you know, that works great for some things and not so great for other things. And I'll pick different mics to use depending on whether I'm miking the cabinet up close or from a distance. And we're gonna get into that in the next little topic. So just to finish up on selecting a guitar amp, what frequently happens after auditioning a bunch of guitar amps is that the guys in the band will say, you know, hey, you know, I really like this element of that amp and this other element of the other amp, and then this amp, and you know, that kind of stuff. And I do that myself a lot. Like I'm always, especially when it comes time to make a converged record, I usually have this huge line of amps because I like something about this one and something about that one. And you know, it's like, well, I love Swedish death metal and I love the Hot Snakes, and I want to find the perfect blend between those two things, or you know, but a lot of cases they just really don't work well together, and that can be a case of a compromise being bad. It's not the two things are so different from one another that rather than complement each other, they just sort of negate each other. So I'd be very careful about blending amps. So it's something that you can do, but I tend to do it on separate tracks so that I can decide that blend later. And more often than not, when I do set up a bunch of amps, in my mix, I usually am paring it down to one or maybe two, where one is heavily favored. So be a little bit careful about blending amps, especially blending amps on the way into your system. Try to keep them separate from each other. But that being said, I do blend amps all the time, and sometimes you really can find a unique sound by blending a bunch of different stuff. But I would urge you, before you resort to that, to really audition not only each amp and trying to find a favorite, but each amp and cabinet pairing that you have at your disposal. You know, some amps just rule out of certain cabinets and sound terrible out of others. And then also, if you dial in an amp for a certain cabinet, when you move that over to another cabinet, you're going to have to redial it in. It's instantly going to feel probably wrong until you redial that amp. So that's my thoughts on selecting a guitar amp. And then once I've selected a guitar amp, then it's time to start miking it. And when it comes time to mic an amp, the first thing you want to do is sort of see what you have in your mic locker, what's available to you, and then what will best work and capture the sounds that you have. Sometimes I take two philosophies in recording guitars when choosing microphones. Like if I have an exceedingly mid-rangey guitar tone, I may want to use more of a scooped sounding mic to counteract the mid-ranginess of that guitar. However, if I have an exceedingly mid-rangey amp that I'm combining with an exceedingly scooped amp, I might actually want to use a very mid-rangey mic on the mid-rangey amp and a kind of scooped mic on the scooped amp to actually further the distinction between the two tones. I find that I can blend two amplifiers together better when they are more different from one another than closer to each other. So I will, some of my favorite microphones for guitar are the Heil PR31. It's a great dynamic microphone, or the PR30. It's essentially the same mic. And that's got that classic sort of 57 sound, but done with a little bit more transparency than a 57. And Bob Heil's a really great guy. I think he makes a great mic, and I've been using that stuff for years. Another favorite of mine, of course, is the SM57. It's just classic, can't go wrong. And if I'm working really quickly, just jam a 57 in front of it, you're good. There's the Royer 121, which of course is a very often used guitar mic and super smooth sounding ribbon mic on guitar. I prefer the passive version of that. In most cases with ribbon mics, I do prefer the passive version. I feel like the active versions are typically too hot and also cost too much. And my recent, speaking of active ribbon mics, my recent acquisition, actually this is maybe the first or second record I used it on, is the AEA N22, which is their new active ribbon mic. It's a cardioid microphone, and it's quite a bit thinner sounding than the Royer mic, but it is sort of the closest mic that I've ever used to a finished guitar sound, actually. And you know what? I can play some audio examples of this stuff. So let me sort of dial in Pro Tools here for a second. So when I was tracking this, as you saw me, I think I actually may have a photo somewhere in here. Yeah, here we go. So these are the mics that I chose to use on this cabinet. This is a Blackstar 2x12 cabinet. It's actually a Blackstar Artisan 30 amp, and there's one Celestion V30 in there, as well as one Weber speaker. I forget which model number the Weber is, but it's one of their ceramic magnet British style speakers. And the Weber actually has something on it called a beam blocker, which is this little sort of like dome type thing that you can, when you're installing the speaker, you install the beam blocker first and then install the speaker in front of it. If you want to just Google beam blocker, you'll find it. But it's this, basically it makes the speaker baffle almost look like the stencil of the letter O. So there's like a thing that sort of floats in the middle of the speaker that's dome shaped that deflects sound coming off the middle of the speaker, disperses it. So when you're standing in the room with this cabinet, it's not as directional as the average 2x12. A lot of 2x12s are very like straight ahead. And this one's actually open back too, so it really, between the open back and the beam blocker thing, it really throws the sound all over the room, which is great. If you're a guitarist and you're standing beside your amp or a little bit above the amp or something like that, you can still hear it. And it's also great if you're at a show and you're in the front row, you don't get that like laser beam treble thing right in your face. It's more of a natural dispersed sound. So I think that what you see here is this is an RCA 44BX ribbon mic beside a Unidyne Shure SM57. And those are on the Weber speaker about a foot back or so. And then the mic beside it is the AEA N22 on the V30. And I ended up, this is not my final mic position, I ended up jamming the N22 right up on the grill, and because I felt like it's kind of thin on the bottom, so it really wants to be jammed right up on the guitar amp to sound great. If I wanted to combine the N22 with the other mics, I would have to do a little sample alignment to get them the phase to agree between all the mics, since they're in different positions. But I lined up the capsule of the 57 and the capsule of the 44 along the same plane, so those don't seem to need any phase adjustment. So let's take a listen to, let me just, give me a second here to set up some solo buses. I'm going to go into XOR, which lets me cancel each solo. So let's take a look at Pro Tools on the big screen now. And so since the 57 and the 44 are on the same plane, I'm going to make a group out of those, just a temporary group. And yeah, so now I can toggle those on and off in solo together. And let's see, yeah, the gain on those things are way down. I'm going to pan those both to the same side as the N22. So I'm going to listen to Guitar 2, which is Aaron. He's playing more like the meat and potatoes type stuff, so we'll probably be able to judge the sound a little bit better with him. And there's a bunch of feedback crap at the beginning. I'm just going to skip over that. Get some volume. All right, so you know, my first impulse when I first started hearing the N22 was like, oh, it's kind of thin sounding and a little too crunchy. But and then the 44 and the 57 blend feel more like the classic guitar tone that I expect to hear coming out of the speakers. But what I've found in mixing is that, you know, things tend to just get brighter and brighter over the course of a record. You know, you start tracking, you're listening pretty loud, and when you listen loud, you tend to prefer deeper sounds, and then as you get closer to your finished product, you know, you're not listening as loud, and you end up kind of wanting to brighten things up, and by the time you get to the finished master, and we'll actually see this tomorrow as I go from some examples of raw track through finished master, that things just keep getting brighter and brighter and brighter, and I found that when I was mixing, the N22 actually brought me closer to a finished guitar sound without EQ than the 44-57 combo. But yeah, definitely like in solo mode, that 57-44 combo has that extra sub bass and extra low mid fullness that is a little more ear pleasing to begin with. So let's just take a quick listen one more time. You can hear me toggle between them. Cool. And for those of you listening at home, you're supposed to be hearing this pan to one side, by the way. All right, so that's the difference between those two mics. And let's go back to the slides. Yeah. So mic placement. I touched on this a little bit before, but sometimes you want to have the mic jammed right up on the grill. Other times you want to have the mic set back a little bit. And that has a lot to do with what type of microphone you're using, how much proximity effect it has. And for those of you who don't know, proximity effect is sort of an exaggeration of bottom end that happens primarily in cardioid mode of a microphone. If you're using an Omni microphone, you usually have less proximity effect. And it's, the same is true for figure of 8 microphone. And as you move that microphone closer or further from the source, that proximity effect will change. So if you know, if you're miking a guitar cab and you want to either mic the, you know, get the sound of the full cabinet and not just a single speaker, or if you have an excessive amount of bottom end coming off the cabinet, you might pull your microphones back a little bit. And I found that particularly that 44BX is an exceedingly bass heavy microphone. So I'll pull that, when I use that microphone, I'll pull that back from the cab at least a foot and aim it right dead center in the speaker. And that's how I get the best sound out of that microphone. Yeah, so also then, in relation to where you place the microphone on the speaker, you can change your sound a lot. And it's, you know, a fun thing you can do if you ever get the chance is to take a day, and actually I do this still. Every once in a while I need to take a day to do audio experiments in my studio and refresh my memory about what are the differences between these different mic techniques and mic positions. And you know, like the overhead thing I did where I was comparing omnis and figure 8s and cardioids, like I need to do that kind of stuff periodically just to keep those variations fresh in my head. So what I like to do on guitar when I'm trying out new microphones or new mic positions or, you know, new mic preamps even, is to either record a DI guitar and make a loop out of that you then reamp through an amp, or use like a looping guitar pedal and play, like develop a little guitar loop that might have some low stuff and some high stuff, so you have this like repeated performance that you can record the exact same performance over and over again, and then do that performance with, take a mic and then, you know, whatever mic you choose, and mic it close, mic it far, mic it at an angle, mic it at the center of the cone, mic it at the edge of the dust cap, mic it at the edge of the speaker. You know, do all this different stuff and see for yourself how that really affects the guitar tone. There's a neat thing I've seen recently, which is like a little guitar mic robot that somebody made that kind of moves the mic around by a joystick, and you can in real time hear how that varies. And there's also some guitar amp plugins that allow you to move the mic around, and that can help you sort of determine how mic position will change based on that. But that's your first source of EQ. Well, obviously the amp and the player and the guitar and all that stuff is really your first source of EQ, but the first, as an audio engineer, the microphone placement is your first source of EQ. So the closer you can get to a finished product by placing your mic correctly, the less work you'll have to do down the line, and the closer to a finished product you will have as you're tracking, and you'll make better decisions about the tones of all the other instruments all along the way. So do a little experiment, see what you like best for mic positions, and then, or see how mic positions vary, mentally catalog that, and then pull out those tools that you have as various people come through and ask you to record them. So that's with working with a single microphone. But sometimes you might want to use multiple microphones, and you know, when in doubt, a single microphone is always safer, because as soon as you throw 2 mics into the mix, you're welcoming problems. So there's a little thing which I think I'm actually going to play tomorrow in the bass thing, where I did a little demo of one way to do some phase checking between various microphones on an amp, moving them around. You can also do that using some sample alignment, like the Pro Tools has a thing called Time Adjuster that can let you slide around tracks a little bit, or there's also a company called Little Labs has a device called the IBP, which is an all-pass filter that can let you phase align multiple microphones. But the best way to do it is to really get it right at the source. And the first way that I start is just visually. Like, if you can, take the take the windscreen off the mic and figure out where the capsule really is. You know, like on a SM7, for example, it's really deep into the mic. It might be, 2 or 3 inches in from the edge of the mic, whereas like On an SM57, it's right towards the edge. So if you're using an SM57 and an SM7 on the same cabinet, first thing you want to do is kind of like line up the capsules, and that'll give you the best starting point for time alignment. Again, like I was talking about earlier, when I use multiple microphones, I like to, rather than use two similar sounding mics, or two similar sounding mic positions, I'll use two really different sounding microphones in two really different sounding mic positions. And if there's less overlap in tonality between the two signals, and actually even further than that, I'll use two different sounding mic preamps to capture those two different sounding mics in two different sounding positions to sort of further the tonal difference between them, which actually makes them have less of a phase relationship between them. It makes it a little bit harder to dial in the phase after the fact, but it's the phase relationship becomes a little bit less important between them. I will typically blend those microphones on the way in if I feel pretty confident about them, and there's kind of two ways that I do that. I have a mixing console, so I can run my mic preamps into some channels of my mixing console and then sum them together down to one input into Pro Tools, and that sort of means there's fewer decisions I have to make later. If I don't have the confidence about how I want to blend the mics together on the way in, I'll keep them on separate tracks. Or if I'm doing multiple amplifiers, I'll try to keep those on separate tracks as well. If you don't have a mixing console and you choose to blend microphones on the way in Pro Tools, you can basically make yourself, let's say you want to combine two mics down to one track, you can just make yourself 3 tracks. You will have 2 aux inputs and then 1 audio track. So for the 2 aux inputs, you'll assign your hardware inputs from your microphone preamps. So let's say those are going into inputs 1, 2. You'll assign your aux inputs to be inputs 1 and 2. And then you'll assign the aux outputs to a bus. And you can make your own bus and name it, or you can say, I want to assign each of these auxes to bus 1 out. And then the third track that you've made as an audio track, set the input of that audio track to the corresponding bus of your aux inputs. And that will allow you to digitally control the blend between the 2 microphones and record them onto one track. You have to be a little bit wary of imparting some latency into the signal when doing it that way. But if you're set up well, it shouldn't be much of a problem. But I do that in the analog world. Okay, and in addition to close miking the amps, sometimes you might want to have an ambient mic on the guitar amp. Yeah, let's actually, here, you know what? I have ambient mics on this guitar amp. Let's listen to them. I'm going to toggle between close and ambient mic and then play both of them. Okay, so one thing I did with the ambient mics on this particular project, and I don't always do it this way, but when we were done tracking drums, I left the overheads set up on the drum set. And without changing any of the settings on the overheads, I used the overhead drum mics as my ambient guitar mics. And I'll do that with overheads or room mics or whatever on the drum set, and that, I feel, sort of helps impart a feeling that the guitars were played in the same room as the drum set. Sometimes I'll even send the guitar room mics out the same channels for the same outboard processing as the overheads and really make it gel like a live recording. And it's a very small, subtle thing to do, but I think it's those little small details that really give you that sense of being there, and I think it helps with that. The other reason why I like to use room mics for a guitar, actually two reasons. In this case, I'm using a stereo room mic on the guitar, the stereo overheads. Sometimes I'll record bands that just have one guitarist, and we don't always want to double the guitar tracks. So it's nice to have a little bit of presence, like if the guitar is just out of like the left speaker for the Van Halen thing, for example. Like you'll always hear Van Halen records. It's just like left panned rhythm guitar and then some ambience on the right side. That gives you a sense of space on a mono guitar that you wouldn't get if you just had one single mono guitar hard panned. And then a mono guitar sort of panned up the middle sometimes conflicts a little bit too much with the drums, bass, and vocals. So it's nice to pan up the guitar even if it is a mono guitar. So that'll give it a sense of space. So sometimes, you know, I might have one guitarist in the band and they just do the verses or single guitar, and then the chorus is doubled, or maybe there's a guitar break and it's just one guitar happening at any given point in the song. And particularly when you're listening on headphones, you know, like in real life, you never listen to music where you absolutely can hear nothing from your right ear and only hear stuff from your left ear. So having a little bit of room mic, or maybe it's reverb or whatever on a guitar, or maybe it's not hard panning the guitar, a little bit of presence in the opposite speaker can keep you from feeling disoriented when listening to something on headphones. Actually, some of the best headphone amps actually have like a crosstalk feature where it will impart a bit of the right channel into the left and vice versa, so that you don't feel disoriented when you're listening on headphones. It feels more like the experience of listening on speakers. And I think that those things might even put a subtle delay on the opposite channel that it bleeds in. Okay, so room mics. Now, final thing I'll talk about miking is about the idea of running DIs, and then with the interest of reamping or editing. One of the common sort of modern production techniques is to, some people don't use guitar amps anymore, and they just record DIs and use amp simulators. I don't typically do that, but it's nice to be able to see the transients of a guitar signal. A lot of like heavily distorted, you know, like this thing just looks like a giant worm. You don't know what's going on. It's just a bunch of fat waves. But if you had a DI track, I think I actually have a DI bass. Yeah, see, let's zoom in on this bass thing. Yeah, can't see it that well, but you can see a little bit more of the dynamic range of the bass guitar in the DI than you can in the microphones. Certainly when comparing the bass, maybe not so much the bass sub channel, but when comparing the bass mic to the DI bass, you can see the attack of things better. So if you feel like you're going to be editing the guitars, if you have a particularly sloppy guitarist, or if you're trying to go for that ultra tight guitar thing and you think you're going to need to edit some guitar performances, sometimes a DI, even if you don't use it at all in your mix, can be a helpful tool to guide you as to where the guitar player is actually picking. I feel as though the whole concept of DIs is a lot about indecisiveness. At least in my studio experience, it's like we don't know if we can get a good guitar sound now, so let's just save that for later, and we'll get a guitar tone later. And a lot of times when I mix records, people will or mix only records, some records I haven't recorded, people will send me DI guitars and ask me to reamp them. And I really try to avoid that whenever possible, because I feel like guitar players and amplifiers interact with one another. You know, you feel a certain amount of air moving off an amp, and different amps respond to you in different ways, and that causes you to change the way that you play. And to perform with a temporary guitar tone is, to me, is kind of like flying blind. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's the best guitar tones I've ever got have not been reamps. They've been a guitar player interacting with their amp and really knowing what it does. And actually, I find that even for like, you know, real organic guitar tones in my studio, I can judge them best when I play the guitar myself. You know, I don't do it exclusively. I have the guitar player in the group play, play their rig, but then if it's not feeling quite right, I'll grab their guitar and just play a little bit and be like, oh yeah, okay, there is like this little weird thing going on that I didn't notice until I started playing, because I didn't. There's like a feedback loop that happens between the player's brain and the amp that you don't have unless you actually experience it for yourself. So, and when you set out with the idea that you're going to DI your guitars and then later reamp them, then you're setting out with the idea to remove that feedback loop from the recording process. But that being said, if you're really indecisive, or if you're recording at home in a place where you're not allowed to make any noise, or you think you nailed it, but you're not sure, and you want to just have a safety net. Sometimes DIs are cool. I don't do them by default, but if I'm unsure about something, I will record a DI. And I think I only recorded this bass DI in case I wanted to sort of illustrate some amp simulator type stuff with the bass, which I probably won't do. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't even record a bass DI. All right, so that's pretty much it for miking the guitar rig. Does anybody have any questions thus far about the guitar setup, amp setup, or miking?
I got one. As far as like distant miking on a cab, do you typically just use the drum stuff, or do you ever just like set a mic like 4 or 5 feet off of the cab itself?
I don't typically do that. I sort of take the same approach that I do. Like if I'm miking a guitar and the drum setup's totally broken down and I'm getting a new ambient mic, I kind of take the opposite approach, or sorry, a similar approach to what I do with the diffused drum mics. I won't necessarily put them, in my bathroom around the corner from the amp, but like I'll aim, like if I'm the guitar amp aimed at that back wall, I might put an amp sort of beside the guitar amp, also pointed at the back wall. So it's getting some ambient stuff off the cabinet and it's getting the reflections off that wall. So remove that like real close stuff and give it a little bit of like pre-delay from when the amp happens to when the room mic hears it. And sometimes I'll use kind of crappy room mics too, or like a dynamic mic, so it sounds more like the bleed of the guitar into a drum mic rather than like a real nice, pretty room tone on the guitar. You can even take it one step further, and if you really want to make it sound live, you can put a mic in the corner of the room over there, and then set up a snare drum next to it. Turn the snares on and let the amp rattle the snares, and it'll feel more like more like you're really there.
A couple people were very excited about the feedback in your guitar tracks. So can you talk about kind of the secret of how you get that awesome, like perfect feedback?
Sure. Well, feedback is super frustrating and totally out of control and hard to control, and you can't be married to getting a certain type of feedback. You just kind of have to do it and see what happens and hope for the best. But the way that I like to handle feedback is, and it's the goal of feedback is typically to give you that feeling that you're there, that it's a show and it's happening organically. However, I find that communication with a guitarist when we're doing a track by track type thing, like let's say we track the drums to scratch guitars and we're recording only guitar, I find that the communication with that guitarist is best when they're sitting or standing in the control room with me, and we can easily talk back and forth. We don't have to have headphones and a talkback mic, because like nobody likes playing in headphones. It's sort of annoying. It's better to just have speakers cranked up and other people to talk to without worrying about pressing talkback buttons and all that kind of stuff. So usually it's me sitting at my console, guitar player's here, and we're going back and forth, dialing in the bulk of all of the rhythm guitars. And then before I leave that guitar tone, I will then move them out into my live room, set them up in front of the amp, and give them headphones and a talkback mic at that point. But before that, we'll sort of plan out, we want feedback at all these locations. And depending on how much it is, I'll either create a new playlist in Pro Tools and then record another full take of the song, sort of with the guitar player standing in front of the amp, and then just sort of go in manual, be like, okay, I want to grab this little section and grab that little section, and then drop it into the main playlist. Or we'll just do a bunch of little punch-ins on the same track. I don't like to do dedicated feedback overdubs. To me, that sounds a little bit canned. I know some people will, record their rhythm guitars clean and then go in and just sort of like try to bring in feedback where it's necessary. I will have them play along with the riffs and then punch in or edit in just the necessary areas, so we have a balance of tight rhythm tracking in the control room with the wild tracking in the live room, and kind of find what's great about each performance, and then just grab snippets from each and make a master track.
Cool. We've got one more from Adrian here. How do you get rid of guitar fizz noise when you use tones with a lot of distortion in a DAW?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in guitar mixing, but there's a lot of ways to do it. It's most amps, it seems to be around like 11K, so you can use a notch filter to remove it. Some people will use a low pass filter, which I try to avoid because I think that low passing it removes all of the good air, which gives the guitar tone a sense of three-dimensionality.
This is something that I struggle with, and I think is very important to talk about in this part. Like, how would you, when you're talking about mic selection and placement, how would you keep the good air without the bad stuff that you would need to?
Well, it has a lot
out?
to do with the gain staging on your amp, and if you're using a pedal or not. And so if you have a pedal, how that's set, how the gain is set, and how the master volume is set. You'll hear, I probably should have talked a little bit more about master volume earlier, but depending on your amplifier and your cabinet, the tone is going to change drastically based on where your master is set. And, at lower levels, you're going to have more headroom and sort of more responsiveness, but at higher levels, you're going to have more raunch. The mid-range is going to come forward, the low mids are going to come out, the speakers are going to start compressing and sort of evening out your tone. You're going to get more feedback and more sustain with more volume, but it's at the same time, there's the sound of metal is lower master volumes and more crunch and more articulation. So depending on the style that you're playing and the song that you're doing, you might want a super loud sound, you might want a super quiet. So try to dial that in. But the other thing that I'm noticing is the presence kind of will vary in a lot of amps, where when you're down really low, you get a really sizzly sound. You bring it up to like medium high, the mid-range fills in, you don't hear so much sizzle. Then you go up even higher, and then a different kind of sizzle comes out. So depending on what type of sizzle you like or don't like and how open you want the tone, you just kind of adjust your master volume or change your speaker cabinets. Use lower wattage speakers or darker sounding speakers that will sort of roll. I mean, all speakers roll off high end. But they just do it to different degrees. Like the higher wattage Celestians and like the neodymium magnet Celestians are closer to PA speakers, and they don't roll off nearly as much high end as say like a V30 will. Actually my current favorite speakers are made by Weber. I'm using usually a combination of a Alnico Blue Dog with a hemp cone and a ceramic silver bell with a paper cone. And the hemp cone especially does a great job of rolling off the exceedingly sizzly high end. So you can, you do that with amp selection, but you also do that with microphone selection. Certain dynamic microphones, for example, like Beyer M88, a very mid-range forward microphone, doesn't have too much sizzle, has a nice bottom end. If you have an extra sizzly guitar amp, you might choose an M88, or you might choose to rely more heavily on like a Royer 121 ribbon mic, which is going to roll off a lot of the top. You got to be a little bit careful about those mics that roll off all the top, because you do want a little bit of top in there. So maybe you have a Royer combined with a dynamic mic, like a Beyer 201 has quite a bit of sizzle, so you can have the bulk of your sound come from the Royer. You can blend in a little bit of the Beyer there to just give it some three-dimensionality, or whatever. Pick cool mics. Try a bunch of different stuff till you find the right mic to work with the amplifier. And of course, microphone preamp is huge too. Like more transformers sound different than no transformers. They tend to add a certain amount of weight to the sound and reduce some of that sizzle. But if you've already recorded it and you're stuck with a really sizzly guitar, notch filtering is your friend, and sort of sometimes boosting first is an easier way to find where that frequency is. So like boost like a narrow bandwidth Bell EQ, and then search around till you find that type stuff, find that frequency, and then cut it at that same frequency. And then a certain amount of cut will give you, you'll probably cut too much at first because you want to get rid of that stuff entirely, and then you realize that it starts sounding a little fake, so it starts sounding like a pod or something, and then bring that stuff back in and it'll feel a little bit more organic.
Okay.
Just one other quick thing about that. Another cool trick for that is to use a de-esser on the guitar. You can, especially a de-esser that, or a multi-band compressor that can let you sort of dial in specific frequencies. The Waves de-esser is pretty good for that. Or like Wave C4 is not bad. You can kind of dial in what's the sizzly frequency and pull that down. So you can still kind of boost the brightness of the guitar with another EQ, but then reduce the sizzle with that de-esser.
Great. All right. And some people in the chat room are going to cry. Like, I think there are like 7 or 8 people who all wanted to know this same thing, and I don't want the internet to cry. So, Ed Lamb says, I was curious about the guitar tones of bands you've recorded like Nails and Trap Them who use the Boss HM2 pedal. It's all about the HM2. Tones are so clear, yet still retain the signature HM2 style grit. How do you approach recording, mixing that sort of sound? I loved Sick Key said that Nails record is the dirtiest, most pissed off guitar tone I have ever heard, namely like Wide Open Wound. So could you elaborate on your use of that?
Nails are dirty and pissed off people, and and that tone starts with the people. So yeah, I mean, the HM2 is a very specific sound, and it sort of, I think the HM2 as we know it today, which has sort of enjoyed a renaissance as of late. Comes from early Swedish death metal. There's sort of like 2 classic death metals to me. There's the Florida death metal, which tended to be solid state guitar amps, like the Ampeg VH140C and the SS and some of the Crate stuff and some PV stuff. And Finn and I love the PV Bandit. We talk about that stuff all the time. And then the Swedish death metal sound actually came from different PV Bandits and Marshalls with the Boss HM2 pedal. And it has this very specific sort of EQ filter to it that just sounds like an angry tractor being played through a guitar amp. There's other pedals actually that do essentially the same thing. There's the Arion Metal Master, which is like I think kind of like a clone of the HM2, but with crappy parts. And that's a little bit more searing and sizzly than the HM2. And then there's also this great mastering studio that I use sometimes called the Norm Restore Mastering, and they're kind of starting up a pedal company, and they have something called the LHP, which is I believe, sort of short for Left Hand Path, named after the Entombed record. And that's a similar tone to the HM2, but with a little more control of the mid-range and presence. And I actually got a pretty convincing HM2 tone recently out of a Mesa Mark III combo and a Boss Metal Zone going into it. So this HM2 sound is becoming like a lot more common these days, and I think a lot of the bands doing it, like Trap Them and Nails, are aware of that, and don't want to get too lumped into what everybody else is doing, because when I make records, I try to make them sort of timeless. I don't want people to like put on one of my records and go like, oh yeah, 2009. Like I want to know, or 2014 or whatever. Like I want people to be able to always enjoy the music that I do. So as trends sort of come and become certain prevailing winds, I think myself and a lot of the bands that I record, we try to move away from that. So the early Nails records really were just straight up like Marshall HM2 kind of sounds. And the key to that, the classic like Swedish death metal dialed in HM2 sound is really in the gain staging. You take the pedal, you pretty much just crank the level, you definitely crank the low and the high knob, and then sort of gain to taste. And then, the EQ on the amp matters, but it's really about the input gain and the master volume. And just there's a point when that stuff just kind of, it sounds like nothing. It sounds thin and small and crappy, and then you get to a certain point of the master volume when all of a sudden like it fills in the 3 dimensionalities there, and it doesn't sound like this weird canned tone, and it just becomes this totally menacing monstrosity. But then a little too far, and it's totally incomprehensible. This pedal is like a really fine balance, and you can do it with just about any amp, solid state amps, tube amps, whatever. Like as long as you have enough control over all the different things, you can find the right balance. And I've done, one of my favorite amps to do it with is, I have this Guild Titan, totally weird old amp, and it's just killer for that. I also, Gibson Titan. I have a Guild Thunder bass that's actually pretty good with it too. But the, vintage Marshalls like JMPs and 800s are sort of like the typical way that tone is done. With the most recent Nails record, they were really into the idea of, well, let's get something that has that level of just antisocial aggression, just anger, and it's just a middle finger to to good sound quality. So what we decided to do was kind of take that. This was a sort of a complicated amp setup for me, and big juggling act. So we took that sort of stock Swedish metal tone, Swedish death metal tone with the HM2, and I can't remember which amp we used for it. It might have been a JMP. I don't know. I have a lot of stuff, and I'm really bad at remembering the details of what I did. But there's a stock sort of HM2 sound in there, but that's sort of getting all the mid-range. So I probably did use my Marshall because it's not a super bassy amp. So that's kind of getting the mid-range, and then the bottom end is mostly coming from an amp called the Hovercraft, which is made in Portland, Oregon. It's a small company that kind of they get kind of cheap amps and then rebuild them and repurpose them into something different. And the amp that I have is a Hovercraft Dwarvenaut 20. It's a 20-watt amp. It began its life as a Jet City, but now it's more like an old orange with a fuzz pedal in front of it. So that's got this like real super smooth, greasy, slimy, ultra saturated, compressed kind of almost like stoner doom kind of sleep kind of sound to it. So there's that, but it's not a very precise sounding amp. So the HM2 sort of added this like mid-range raunch and articulation, and then the Dwarvenaut sort of added all this bottom end smear. Because the band is not a super precise band. The fact that it's like overwhelming and incomprehensible at times is, I think, one of the big strengths of the band. So those are two signals that contribute to the sound, and then the final contribution was sort of inspired by Norway. We got a metal zone and just sort of tweaked that out to some real awful sounding settings and ran that into a Altec, I forget the model number, just the classic Altec tube microphone preamp. It's like a 5-channel mixer tube preamp. 1567A, I think, is the model number of it. So, and that's kind of quite a dark mic preamp. So if you've ever tried to like run a distortion pedal right into the board, you know that it's just like psss. So I used a dark mic preamp, tube mic preamp, so that it would kind of compress the signal, distort it a little bit more, and make it dark. I love like all those old garage records, especially like Stooges and MC5 type stuff, and that sounds like the microphone preamps are distorted on the guitars. It's not just distortion coming off the guitar, but it's like distortion coming from the mic. And supposedly like the early Soundgarden records were done that way too. I don't know if you have any specific knowledge of that, Tad, but.
I think Kim was using those Music Man amps at that point.
Yeah.
HD 120s or something.
Yeah, those are cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I heard in some interview at one point that he was talking about how I think they used like a Summit tube mic preamp and would overdrive the tube mic preamp, so you're getting like overdrive from the amp, but also a different type of overdrive from the microphone. So I had that whole direct double overdrive signal being blended in with two amplifiers, and then the cumulative effect of that is a little more broadband than most of the guitar tones I would go to. I mean, that really, the metal zone thing really encroaches upon the cymbal sound, and the Hovercraft really encroaches upon the bass tone. But
so before we move on, because we got about run a little bit short on time,
Sorry.
I want to add that there's one critical element of this sound, and I'm not being facetious here. It really can't be understated, which is Todd. I mean, Todd Jones is a very unique human being as a player and a person, and that matters a lot. I could plug in. Todd is a very good friend of mine. I could plug into that same setup. I wouldn't sound like Todd. You wouldn't sound like Todd, and it's important to remember that the human ingredient. Part of what makes so many of your recordings so great is the human beings involved with them. And that's something that I think we should all remember.
Which is why you were saying the first segment of today, like working with your client,
Yeah.
don't skip that.
Yeah.
That's important stuff.
Oh, just I feel like I should say, Todd didn't do all the guitars on that though. They have a second guitarist now, Seba, and he's awesome.
Oh, and he
And,
played on that too?
Yeah, they're just equal. Like I forget if Todd's left and he's right or vice versa, but I don't think anybody pinch hit it for anybody else on that one.
Todd is certainly the main driving force,
Yeah,
for
for sure.
creatively, and but regardless, point being, the humans that played on the record, whoever they
Yeah.
are, that's a huge part of the sound, and gear is great and all that, but the people.
I learned that lesson the hard way many years ago. I recorded a record that some people liked, and then shortly thereafter, I had a band come in and say, "We love this record. Do everything exactly the same as you did on that record." And I really did my best to do everything, engineering-wise, exactly the same as I had done on this record that they really loved. And that record just didn't really turn out very good because they were different players. They had different songs and they played in a different way. And you got to always listen to who it is that you're recording and do what works best for them and optimize the song, and don't get married to what somebody else did. But just, it's important to reference other stuff just to keep yourself honest and to calibrate your ears. But really, you need to listen to the song and do what's best for the song.
Yeah, I think with that we are getting a little short on time, so let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, so guitar tracking, and we can go through this stuff pretty quickly. When you are tracking a guitar, there's a definite difference between, actually we've kind of already covered a lot of this, but there's a definite difference between how you play when you're sitting and you're standing, and I find that for challenging left-hand stuff, I do better when I'm sitting down playing because my hand's right here, I can see what's going on and I'm more comfortable. But I also, when I'm playing sitting down, my right arm is sort of tucked up and I can be kind of precise with my picking, but I can't, I don't have the extension to do big strums. And if something's like a little bit more rhythmically challenging or picking challenging, I find standing up works better for me. And there's also, I'll grab my guitar real quick. There's also a big difference between how people pick. I have a pick somewhere. Sometimes when people sit, they, let me turn on this guitar DI, you still there? Yeah, so people sit, they have their pick sort of flat against the string. But when people stand, sometimes they're at an angle and they start picking like, so you get all this extra scratchiness. And I think I actually had a little problem with Kenny on the bass tracks for this record where he was picking at kind of an angle to the strings, and it can be a little easier to play faster when you're sort of picking at an angle, but you get this kind of scratchy tone, and you can sometimes adjust that based on whether you sit or stand. And one thing that's important when you are sitting, try to have something around in your studio, whether it's a footstool or a block or something like that, so the guitarist, or a chair like this one that has a leg that you can put your foot on. It's really good to be able to cradle your guitar when you're sitting down, and make sure the person is comfortable whether they choose to sit or stand, and can play well. And then, so the next thing, I pretty much already covered this whole live room versus control room thing. That's really about feedback, but it's also what the person is most comfortable with. If they are always playing in front of their amp and they do a ton of feedback, then they're going to want to be in front of the amp. There's a couple bands I've recorded a few times. One's called Meek is Murder, and the other one's called Trenchfoot. And both of those bands, like those guys are just like super dialed in with what they're going to play, and they're not particularly meticulous about their performances, but they're very meticulous about the idea that interaction with your amp is just the most important thing in your performance. And they'll actually, it's kind of wild. Both of those bands will like track the drums, and then we'll sequence the album. Like, forget about sequencing and mastering. We'll sequence the whole record before we even start tracking the guitars, because they have this specific idea of what kind of spacing they want between each song on the album. And then they'll just go in and just do the whole record in one pass. Or they might do like side A in one pass. Occasionally going back to punch in, but for the most part, it's just like they know that there's going to be like, a short gap between song 1 and 2 and a couple of stick clicks, and they just want it to feel like one big long piece of music. So they'll record it as one big long piece of music, and it's kind of neat to do it that way, and it goes really quickly if they're if they're that confident in their playing and not super meticulous about it. So sometimes I will record someone exclusively in the live room, but for the most part I'm recording people in the control room. And I did want to touch on adjusting how you play for a better recording, which is mentioned earlier when I was talking about the intonation stuff, which is really just, how hard are you strumming, how hard are you fretting, do you naturally sit in a way that you pull the neck back when you play, or do you sort of play balanced on the lower horn of the guitar where you're pushing the neck forward, and how does all that stuff affect your intonation, and how does it affect your ability to play in tune? And just try to be observant, especially if you're an engineer who happens to play an instrument. Try to be observant how the person you're recording is playing their instrument, and say like, hey, you know what? If you just sat a little bit differently or angled the guitar a little bit differently, maybe you'd play better. Or maybe you'll see them like playing a riff in some bizarre position, and you could suggest like, hey, you know what? Instead of playing it over here, you could play it over there, and the fingering would be a lot easier. If you have some knowledge about how to play guitar, it's a lot easier to share that information with that person. And the same goes for drums or bass, vocals, piano, whatever it may be. The more instruments you know how to play, the greater your musical vocabulary will be, and the greater your ability to communicate with the people you're recording are, because you have a certain empathy for the position that they're in. I'm not a particularly great drummer, but I can play well enough that I have a good understanding about what a drummer goes through when they're recording, and why certain things are possible and what things aren't possible. So when I'm communicating with them, I can kind of speak their language and say like, hey, let's try this, or do a double stroke there, or do a flam here, or take a dump there, or whatever it happens to be. And same with guitar, bass, vocals. Just if you have a rudimentary understanding of how to play all those instruments, then you can be a better support system for those players. Help them adjust their playing to record better. Okay, so another thing about guitar tracking is I think a lot of engineers, when they hear mistake, the flag goes off. They're like, okay, oh, stop, dude, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. People don't necessarily want to hear that right away. Let them do a few takes all the way through and figure the song out for themselves, and let them build a little momentum, let them get warmed up, and let them get familiar with the actual take. I mean, they might know the song well, but they might not know the actual take that they're recording too well. So let them get familiar with that, and let them build some momentum as they're tracking. So don't interrupt them immediately. Let them get through the song at least a few times before you start picking it apart. And then, of course, be supportive and provide constructive criticism as you're doing it. Then there's the choice of, do you want to double track the guitars or not? And in most cases, of the type of bands that I'm doing, the guitars are double tracked and hard panned. You don't always have to. Double tracking certainly widens the sound, but also kind of can lessen the amount of intimacy you feel in the sound. A single guitar, a single performance, fewer microphones is usually a more pure sound and will give you more the sense of being there, whereas like double tracking will give you more of a sound stage and more like a concert kind of vibe, and quad tracking will do so even more. But with each layer that you add, you're adding size, but you're removing punch. So just keep that in mind as you add layers and add microphones and add ambient mics and all that stuff. So I'm going to skip over this idea of the voice for now. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Then creative versus clerical linearity. What I mean by clerical linearity is sort of the admin stuff that you're doing as you're recording guitars. You're sort of thinking ahead about like, oh yeah, we got to get, there's two guitarists playing on this song, and we have like maybe 2 or 3 guitar sounds that we're working on in this song, and but we're doing a whole album, and we're going to be using this, tone 1 on a bunch of spots in the album and tone 2 on a bunch of spots in the album. So from an engineer's perspective, you're thinking about it, just the clerical linearity is like, set up this guitar tone, record everything you got to do with this guitar tone, then move on to the next guitar tone, and do everything you got to do with that tone. But musicians don't usually think that way. And if you have sufficient time to set up a bunch of little rigs within your space, and you can follow the way that creative linearity works, I think you'll end up with a better product, more cohesive product, and a product that you are more sort of invested in because you understand the artistic intent of the song better. So if it's possible, let people complete on their guitar overdubs. Let people complete a song at a time. Get through both the primary rhythm track, and if you're doing a secondary rhythm track, the secondary rhythm track, if there's alternate tones for that song, if you can do them on the fly, do them on the fly. If you have to do them later, that's fine. It's up to, but sort of put that. Don't tell the client that they have to record in a certain way. Ask them what they prefer to do, and if they would prefer to really focus on a song at a time rather than a sound at a time, then be malleable and do it that way. If there's two guitar players in the band that are sort of playing an even amount of stuff, once guitar player one gets warmed up, they might want to keep going, and you might want to wait to go back to do the second guitars on those first songs with the second guitar player, or maybe it's more important for them to do to get through all of one kind of song. So just bear in mind as you're tracking a song what will work best creatively for the client. Let them build not only momentum about their ability to perform the song, but the build momentum just in the creative process and letting them see through whatever it is fresh in their head. Okay, and I think that is sort of the end of what I want to talk about for guitar tracking. And I think we can do a few more questions if there's any.
Fantastic. Let's see anything here in the room. If not, then I think we're actually good to kind of wrap for the day. It's been a pretty full day, and
Yes.
I'm excited. Let's talk about tomorrow. What are we doing tomorrow?
Tomorrow we're going to start off sort of really a continuation of what I'm talking about today, which is the first thing will be bass sound and bass tracking. It shares a lot of things with guitar sound and guitar tracking, but the way in which signals are blended in bass is typically quite a bit different than guitar. And bass roll, depending on what type of guitar you have, the bass roll in the band can vary pretty widely. So we'll focus on bass and bass tracking for a little while. Then we're going to talk about vocals and vocal tracking and vocal coaching for a little while. And then we're going to dive into all things mixing. So there'll be the bulk of tomorrow will be on mixing, both sort of the early stages of mix prep, the final mixing, soliciting feedback from your clients, interacting with your clients over the course of several mix revisions, what to do about last minute or after the fact type mix revisions, and then how to guide your client through the mastering process and staying on task and on tap, ready to help them through the mastering, even though your session with them has concluded. Yeah, so I'll see everybody tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to the guys here in the audience.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, everybody, for being here. You guys are awesome. Thank you for everyone out there for joining us today and for the questions and everything that you were sharing in the chat room. Awesome to have you. Hopefully, we will see you all tomorrow. What do you think about today?
I think, Russ, I think this might have been the single best day of my life.
That's what I want to hear. That's all I want to hear.
It would make my day even better if everybody would take advantage of our one-time offer to purchase the class for only $79 if you buy it before the end of today, or the end of tomorrow rather.
Correct.
If you wait, if you buy it after that, it's $99, so you can save yourselves $20 on Kurt's words of wisdom. So I suggest that you take advantage of that and buy it now.
Absolutely. So as Finn was saying, these courses are free to watch live. We love it when you join. We love it when you watch us live. For those of you who might be new, we do a rebroadcast of each day's live broadcast after we end for the day. So in just a little bit after we wrap, we will restart this day. It'll loop throughout the night so you can watch it as many times as you want. and you can stay up all night, and then we'll end it shortly before we start again tomorrow morning at 9. But if you want to be able to have anytime access to actually scrub through and fast forward to the parts that you want to see or skip, the subjects that you already know about, you can do that by purchasing anytime access, as Finn was talking about. It costs $99 for the 2 days. That also includes the bonus reverb impulses that Kurt is included, which is awesome. So thank you, Kurt, for that. And you can get it for that discounted live price of $79 if you do get it before the end of tomorrow. So go ahead and make that choice. There's a buy button directly below the video feed if you choose to have that in your library whenever you want. And we will see you back here tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Pacific, for more with Kurt Ballou here on Creative Live. We'll see you then.